Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is the 5th annual Harriet Tubman lecture, and I just wanted to give a brief background. We could talk the whole time on Harriet Tubman, but I just wanted to give a brief background. This is the lecture to celebrate an American hero, and this is during Black History Month. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in about 1822. She died March 10, 1913. She was an American abolitionist, a humanitarian, an armed scout and spy for the United States Army during the American Civil War. She helped abolitionist John Brown recruit men for his raid on Harper's Ferry. She was an active participant in the struggle for women's suffrage in the post-war era. She was born a slave in Maryland. She was beaten and whipped by her various masters as a child. She suffered a traumatic head wound when an irate slave owner threw a heavy metal object at another slave but hit her in the head instead. She suffered dizziness, pain, spells of hypersomnia throughout her life. She was a devout Christian who experienced strange visions and vivid dreams, which she ascribed to premonitions from God. In 1849, she escaped to Philadelphia, then immediately returned to Maryland to rescue her family. And slowly, one group at a time, she brought relatives out of the state and eventually guided dozens of other slaves to freedom. She traveled at night and in secrecy, and Harriet Tubman, who was known as Moses, never lost a passenger. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, she helped guide fugitives farther north into British North America and helped newly freed slaves find work. When the Civil War began, she worked for the Union Army, first as a cook and a nurse, and then as an armed scout and spy. She was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, which liberated more than 700 slaves. After the war, she retired to her family home on property she had purchased in 1859 in New York, where she cared for her aging parents. She was active in the women's suffrage movement until illness overtook her. She had to be admitted to a home for elderly African Americans that she had helped establish years earlier. After she died in 1913, she became an icon of American courage and freedom. This is my favorite quote by her: "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they had known they were slaves." So I'm very honored that this year our speaker is Dr. Clive Callender. He's a native of New York. He was educated in the public schools and colleges. He completed medical school at Meharry in 1963 as the top-ranking medical student. His surgical training was at Freedman's Hospital. He did his transplant surgery training at the University of Minnesota under Dr. Najarian, and then in Pittsburgh while I was there under Dr. Tom Starzl. After returning to Howard in 1973, Dr. Callender helped develop the first minority-directed dialysis and transplant center and histocompatibility and immunogenetic lab in the country. Prior to receiving his transplant training, Dr. Callender pursued his goal in life to become a medical missionary by volunteering in Nigeria between 1970 and 1971. He is still professor of surgery from 1980 to present. He was the chairman of the department at Howard from 96 to 2008. And the director of the Transplant Center at Howard from 1973 to 2011. Dr. Callender founded the National Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program, or MOTTEP. National MOTTEP is the first national organization to identify a twofold solution to the donor organ shortage problem: disease prevention and increasing donor rates. Since its inception, MOTTEP has been awarded more than $16 million in funding from the Office of Research and Minority Health. National MOTTEP's methodology has contributed to the national increase in minority donor organ rates from 15% in 1990 to 30% in 2008. Blacks have risen from the bottom of organ donation to the top, now exceeding whites and other ethnic minority populations in reference to organ donors per million, from 8 in 1982 to 35 in 2010, and this is largely attributable to Dr. Callender's efforts. Dr. Callender has spoken to both professional and lay audiences for more than 1,000 meetings. That would be every day for more than half of your residency. He's authored over 150 scientific publications. He's a member of numerous, i.e. every important professional society. He serves as a referee for various scientific journals, serves as a member of or advisor of numerous boards, committees, and task force. He has received numerous honors and awards in recognition of his significant contribution, but it is his dream that he be remembered as a God-fearing surgeon who reached the unreachable stars. Dr. Callender has appeared on The Oprah Show, CNN News, the CBS Evening News, and hundreds more. He's received 3 doctorates, honorary doctorates from Hunter College, Meharry, and Howard. In addition to all his incredible accomplishments, though, Dr. Callender has been my mentor and friend for more than 30 years. I'm just delighted that he's here.
Oh, okay. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Clive Callender, and I reached my 81st birthday in November, so it's a pleasure to be anywhere, especially here. And I thank God that He's blessed me with good health so that I can be here to speak to you. It's such an honor to give a lecture, especially the Harriet Tubman lecture, and I think Wallace has presented it so well that I really can't add anything to his spectacular presentation of both Harriet Tubman and myself. So I'm just going to pretty much go according to my slide presentation, which is on the strategies necessary to eliminate transplant disparities in America, which is a tall order, by the way. Actually, in 2002, we wrote a paper that looked at the 12 key issues that are associated with transplant ethnic disparities and identified strategic plans for the elimination of some of these. And this presentation that I'm going to share with you addresses the current status of each of these and identifies 3 additional disparities as well as other steps that can be taken to narrow these disparities, many of which are now more than 40 years old. Hard to believe, time flies. Health disparities in the United States of America are a major source of concern and have been a priority for the past 30 years. Many of you are too young to know about the Heckler report, but in 1985 it was released and for the first time outlined the disparities that exist in the United States. We first became aware of these disparities in transplantation at the end of my training, or towards the end of my training in Minnesota in 1972. And since that time, we've watched as 10 are unchanged or have worsened, and 4 have changed, or in the process of changing, and 3 new ones have been added. And I'm going to share this information with you to show you how far we've come in many ways. Now, one thing that is kind of newish is that while the general gender health disparities in favor of female longevity, few are aware of the gender and the age disparities as they relate to end-stage renal disease and kidney transplantation. And my goal is to educate all of you regarding all of these matters. And at the end of the presentations, I want you to be able to identify first the additional steps necessary for transplant health disparity elimination, and identify which of the 17 disparities have been narrowed or eliminated. And it's my pleasure to see that I've lived through a lot of this and to see how things have improved, while many still remain the same. But the goal is to appreciate the importance and value of fighting political battles from within. I've been around to participate in some of these battles and to emerge victorious in some, and it's been joy to work along with Starzl and many others who have helped us in this battle for equity. Now, recognizing while the female gender is positive for health in general and longevity in females is evident in most countries. There's no offense. We men may make the money, but often we die and leave behind the females to spend it. And that is no different in end-stage and kidney transplantation, but it does have its negative connotations. Also, to identify the wisdom of majority-minority community education and empowerment as a powerful step in the strategy to narrow or eliminate all of these disparities. And I can't emphasize this more than I have in this slide. Now, as I identify the 17 disparities that we talked about, the first one for me is racism. And I think as we talk about the fact that racism is alive and well, I think one of the first things we need to do, I've been saying this for many years without accomplishing it, is to eliminate the use of the term race as a scientific issue and replace it with ethnicity, or if you can't do that, which many people find difficulty in doing, then replace it with ethnicity, race/ethnicity. In all scientific journals, UNOS, Census Bureau, and the federal government. This is a battle that I've been battling for a while and have lost so far, but it's something that I think would do us well. Now, some may ask, well, why is race important? Well, race is really a social issue, and it's not a scientific issue. And as long as we forget that it denigrates our science and realize that we're all human beings. The human genome made it clear we're all the same race, but we have different ethnicities. And so it's important for us to recognize that and recognize every time we talk about it, we are talking about subjugating the African American to be the bottom of the pile and the others to be on top, when we're all the same, and diversity is what makes us special. That's what makes us survive. Now, the second is to recognize that there's a 10 to 20% poor graft survival rate in the transplantation, especially in kidney transplantation. And we need to address this disparity by funding further research into the role of institutionalized racism, which I believe is the bottom line problem that begets the social aspects of health that really foster it. And then the immunologic hyperresponsiveness that we have identified in the African American population, the immunologic heterogeneity. All of these are part and parcel of may be the reason why there's this 10 to 20% poor graft survival rate. Now, of course, we always like to think that it all revolves around genetics, but in many ways, the social determinants of health play a major role in this. And I believe the provision of research funding should be at the level of around $1 billion. However, I can think that and want that, but getting it is another story. African Americans continue to have a 42% higher risk of graft loss 5 years after transplantation. A year after transplantation or 2 years after, it doesn't appear. But by the time you get to 5 years after transplantation, this is what we find. Functional kidney graft survival in African Americans is 1/2 of that of the other ethnic groups, with the Asians having the best survival and the African Americans having the poorest. This disparity remains now some 40 years after Opels identified this. And when he first identified, I thought it was a statistical anomaly. But over time, it's clear now it's much more than that. And this is pretty true that with the more potent immunosuppressive regimens such as tacrolimus, we have better results. And it's clear also that success in transplantation requires an individualized approach to immunosuppression choice and dosing. taking into consideration all of the other aspects. And based upon patient-specific risk factors, age, comorbidities, and socioeconomics. And it's clear that donor and recipient genotyping in the presence of APOL-1 and pharmacogenetics differences do matter. And it's also important to recognize that African Americans require more anti-rejection medications than other ethnic groups for optimal immunosuppression. And this is demonstrated in some of the literature that is quite evident. The incidence of acute rejection is lower in African Americans when tacrolimus and induction therapy are used than in Caucasian ethnic groups. So it's important to understand this and recognize that this is a fact of life, and we have to deal with it. Now, this is the first disparity that I'm going to talk about that actually has changed a lot, and that is the waiting times for African Americans. And the goal was to eliminate transplant waiting times, which was twice as long for whites. And the application of recently, over the last 3 to 4 years, of the Euro-Transplant Model of Danovitch, Cohen and Smits to overcome the barriers of institutionalized racism, hypertension, immunologic hyperresponsiveness, and immunologic heterogeneity, because these are the items that we believe are related to why there's been a disparity in survival. And the application of the Euro-Transplant model was just to make it so that transplant waiting times begin at the time you start dialysis. Throughout my career, it's been clear that African Americans were put on the waiting list maybe 2 to 3 years after they got on dialysis for a number of reasons, which I won't discuss at this time. But this Danovitch-Cohen-Smits model, Euro-Transplant model, overcomes that. And over the last 3 years or so, these transplant waiting times have markedly changed. And so that this disparity is changing and likely will go away within the next 2 or 3 years. The high prevalence and incidence rate for kidney failure, which in blacks is 2 to 4 times more frequent than in the rate for whites. Stress reduction, the Believe Us model, which we developed, exercise, proper nutrition, and the application of the MOTTEP Love Yourself, Take Care of Yourself program in all communities may be a first step to try to address this disparity, which we haven't done much about. We've tried to do something about it, and with time, maybe we'll be able to address this fourth disparity. The fifth disparity, and that has been interesting, is that minorities are referred for dialysis and transplantation 12 to 18 months later than whites. And ethnic groups, if they're educated and empowered, this is a major step to overcome the institutionalized racism that accounts for this. We hope, because of the Euro-Transplant model, will be modified as well as the others. But so far, this has not been demonstrated. It's the hope that this model, the application of it in October 2014, numbers are changing for the better already. In the long term, we're hopeful that this will result in this disparity being eliminated. The green screen, this is a term which I coined in 1996, a little while ago. And the green screen applies to whether or not you have money or not. And I remember when we talked with Starzl, and what happened is when you look at the extrarenal transplants, on the kidney transplant model, you may not see it so much because 96% of the Americans are able to get Medicare. But there's still a group who, after on kidney transplantation, still have green screen. But on liver transplantation, extrarenal transplantation, it was clear that the number of African Americans who were actually on the list was much lower than it ought to be. And we really got to understand the reason it was different was because the blacks never got on the list in the first place. And so they died because, for dialysis, you got the kidney, so you can live on dialysis, but for liver, hearts, and other organs, that wasn't the case. So if you didn't get on the list and you didn't have the funds or the greens to get on the list, then you died. And so as a consequence, the green screen was another issue that still remains a problem for extrarenal transplantation. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's better. And still for kidney transplantation, it's still a problem, but it's not as much of a problem. And as we look for solutions, the woman or man in the mirror can help us find creative ways to enable the under and uninsured patients to be transplanted. However, to be realistic about it, what are the chances of somebody who wants to have equity and wants to have insurance and to increase the taxes? What are the chances of that person winning an election? Little to none. So this is still a problem. The green screen remains a problem for the underinsured or the uninsured. And this is something that we've got to find a way to try to help. Otherwise, the people we transplant after 2 or 3 years after the insurance runs out, or then they will be right back on dialysis or they'll die. And so this is an issue, a disparity that we've got to address, better than we're addressing now. Another disparity is that patient survival rates on dialysis. At one point, African American survival was superior to all other ethnic groups. And I believe the reason for that was because if you're black and you're healthy, you may get transplanted. And so if you're poor, if you're not doing well on dialysis, you stay on dialysis. And it was thought that perhaps that was the reason. Now, as we equalize the Caucasian African-American kidney transplant rate, because at one point only 10% of African Americans were transplanted, whereas 20% of whites were transplanted. And so as we get the equity closer, we are hopeful that that will change. And more recent UNOS data in 2014 indicated that Native American and Latino Hispanic patient survivals were really at the top, and they exceeded African American and white patient survival rates. So this is something that is changing as we speak as well. Now, reducing the organ donor recipient disparity, now over 90,000, requires us to increase organ donation rates in all ethnic groups, especially minorities via community education and empowerment and hospital-family interactions. Now, this is unchanged, unfortunately, except in the African-American population. And this is disturbing to me in many ways because while we have increased organ donation in the African-American population, the relative increase in, or the relative decrease in the Caucasian and Latino Hispanic populations is undesirable. I just share some data with you. In 1982, minorities represented more than 50% of the national transplant waiting list, but represented only 15% of the donor population. And previously, minorities, especially African-American blacks, were thought not likely to donate. However, as we have been involved with our efforts, National MOTTEP and other community education and empowering efforts between 1995 and 2010, you can see the difference in the donation rates per million between African Americans and others. And you can see that the whites, the Latino, Hispanics, and Asian Americans have a drop in that organ donors per million, where the blacks had a rise. And so that blacks now represent 17% of the donor population, while representing 13% of the total United States population, which is a great increase. But the thing that bothers me is that why isn't that same thing happening across the other ethnic groups? And that's something we've got to address. Now, these are current MOTTEP sites, and I think one of the issues we need to do is to have more community education and empowerment sites across the United States of America. We're fortunate to have a site in Pittsburgh, and Lisa is here from CORE, which actually covers West Virginia. Now, National MOTTEP is not alone in this battle. Actually, all organ procurement agencies, WRTC and AMAT, the Association of Multicultural Affairs and Transplantation, have all helped us as we've tried to have special observances such as National Minority Donor Awareness Week, the emphasizing awareness, action, and accountability, and community education and empowerment have contributed to an increased and sustained minority donation rates. Why not have this effort applicable to all ethnic groups? And so this then restates what we've stated earlier, and that most people thought that it was impossible to have African American donation rates to improve, but lo and behold, it has occurred, and we think that this is food for thought. And this indicates to us that when a campaign comprised of a grassroots, face-to-face presentation and interactions along with media reinforcement is applied, donation rates can be increased and sustained. Now, as we try to figure out why other ethnic groups have dropped, I think that maybe in some instances, the application of social media to the exclusion of the face-to-face interactions may partially explain the decrease in other ethnic groups. And so it's just as important, just as in everything else. The face-to-face interaction is something that makes a big difference. And that's something that we can't apply. We can't just put it on Facebook, put it on Twitter, and forget about the importance of one-on-one interactions. The ninth disparity is the disproportionate affectation of FSGS in African Americans with the gene identifications with MYH9 and APOL-1, which is something that may explain why African Americans get more kidney disease and also why they do less well after transplantation. An observation was made by Wilcox, Wang, and Melancon that actually demonstrated the microvascular endothelial dysfunction of the afferent arterioles of the glomerulus are defective in African Americans. And this endothelial dysfunction may be part of the reason why we have such a disparity in African American prevalence of end-stage renal disease, and also why after transplantation the results aren't comparable. Statistically significant inferior graft survival of kidneys and other organs when transplanted into African Americans. This is something that I was surprised to find because originally I thought that maybe the way to overcome the African American poor graft survival was to have more African American donors. But so I was shocked in my research to find that when we used more African American donors, that they didn't survive as well in blacks as did the Asian organs and even the Caucasian organs and Latino Hispanic organs. So we need more research funding to try to identify what can. One thing is clear: we need donors from all the ethnic groups, and so whether they go into one ethnic group or another is irrelevant. The importance is to have more donation rates. And now the 11th disparity is the eliminating the inequitable allocation problem. And I think the Euro-Transplant Model has brought us closer than ever before to equity. And this is something that I'm very proud to be able to say that we are now getting more equitable than we've ever been. I remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, we battled to try to bring this into play, but it was problematic then. But over time, we've had changes in the allocation schema that has eliminated antigens that were less likely to be found in blacks and more common in whites, and gotten to the point now that we can go to all communities and say that we have almost equitable allocation, and therefore we're going to ask all ethnic groups to donate, feeling comfortable that we now have a system that's more equitable than ever before. Institutionalized racism, unfortunately, though, is still alive and well and flourishing. And the elimination of the superior-inferior race concept is paramount in order to overcome the negative health consequences of institutionalized racism, which I feel are at the core of all the majority-minority health disparities. And I think community education and empowerment of all communities is key. It's important as well for every ethnic group to understand that this is something that we need to overcome. The diversity is one of human race's greatest strength, and uh, all areas are now becoming quite aware of this, and this is something that we must share. Now, this is a disparity we have not yet overcome. The unique post-transplant drug responses of African Americans when compared and contrasted to whites. For example, blacks on program have twice the incident rate of diabetes than whites. And actually, when you compare to Latino Hispanics who also have this problem, the difference is that when Latino Hispanics get the diabetes, it's reversible. Whereas when blacks get the diabetes with Prograf, it's not reversible. And so we need more research and study to try to help us address this disparity. A new disparity that many people aren't aware of, and I haven't done as much as I should have in terms of getting this much across, but it is now, we now know that black kidney donors represent 13% of kidney donors, but 44% of the donors who after donation require dialysis and renal transplant. And further research and analysis is essential, because what does this mean? Does this mean that when you get black donors that they need a special consent rate, or what's going on here? And this is something that is new and something that we need to be aware of, and something that we need to educate about so that we can understand this and eliminate it. Another disparity that becomes aware is the impact of gender disparity between male and female donors and transplant recipients. And maybe community education about this will help us to unravel this mystery. When we talk about it, female recipients as compared with male recipients have a 10% increased odds for acute rejection during the first 6 months after transplantation. Female recipients have a 10% lower risk of graft loss secondary to chronic allograft failure. And they have a greater reduction in the risk of chronic graft failure when we use CellCept when compared with men. Conclusions relative to this drawn by Dr. Jeremiah Momper indicate that differences in drugs and their metabolism rates and commonly used transplant meds require the need to identify sex, gender, and dosing. And we all know that research originally was done mostly in white males. And so the need for identification of male and female gender in transplantation is just as important. And so additional research is needed to further elucidate the mechanism for these sex differences in dosing recommendations. A better understanding of these gender differences will speed up the individualization of the treatment for transplant outcomes, which I think is critical. Noncompliance was another disparity that used to be thought to exist. Most of us in the transplant world recognize that the real problem with compliance comes in the younger patients who, for many good reasons, believe that they're immortal and that they're going to live forever, and so they don't need to take their medications. There may be other reasons. They used to say blacks are more non-compliant than other ethnic groups. All the research recently has shown that that is a myth more than anything else. And so we need to address this. Non-compliance is a problem with transplantations, but it's with all transplantation, especially younger transplant patients. Oops, pushed the wrong one. The 17th and final one is ageism. And it's interesting as we look at the data between 1991 and 2011, donors, my point is died, so donors age greater than 50 increased by 200%. Donors age less than 50 decreased by 76%. And standard criteria donors now are less than 50% of the donors. What does that mean, and why is that important? As donor age increases over 50, the rejection rate increases. As the recipient age increases over 50, the rejection rate decreases. Interesting. Why is that? As donor age increases, so does the immunogenicity of the kidney and the incidence of rejection. Older donors, APCs, antigen-presenting cells, exert a more vigorous alloimmune response. Isn't that interesting? The donor kidneys on me have a more vigorous. And intragraft dendritic cells of older donors have a response rate that is aggressive, and they release IL-17A, which promotes rejection. And older recipients release more suppressor cells and tolerogenic factors. Isn't that interesting how age does matter? As if we didn't know that already. As the age of the donor increases, the immunogenicity of the organ increases along with the incidence of rejection. As the age of the recipient increases, the likelihood of transplant tolerance increases, and the likelihood of rejection decreases. I've shared these data with you to help you recognize that, yes, transplant ethnic differences exist as well as age and sex differences, and that there's something that we can do about it. But the real model, the real essence of the presentation is that with community education and empowerment, this can go a long way in helping us overcome these ethnic differences that we can do something about. And I open my presentation for any questions that you may have. The last thing that I'll share with you is this Be Blessed model that we have come up with that we believe can help change the lifestyles, because lifestyle and behavior are the reason for end-stage renal disease, for hypertension, for diabetes, and the risk factors that are responsible for many of the problems we have, not only for end-stage renal disease, but for cancer as well. And with that, I'll open the floor for any questions you may have about this presentation.
Could you just share a little bit of your thoughts about your origination of the MOTTEP program and where it came from, and what goes on when you go out into the communities? We talked about it last night a little bit.
Yeah, it all started when I left Minnesota and came back to Howard University, where I did all my surgical training. And as we had, most of our patients were black, but most of our donors were white. And we looked at this information. Southeastern Organ Procurement Foundation came to me as the remaining black surgeon, because Sam Kuntz had died of complications of hypertension earlier. And so I was one of the few remaining black transplant surgeons at the time. And they asked me, hey, look at this data. 70% of the people on dialysis are black, but so few donors. What can we do about it? So they came to me with that problem, but at the same time, they ran out of money. And so they couldn't do anything to help me. But I was fascinated by the data. And so I shared this with Dr. James Baton, who's an eminent psychologist. And he and his graduate students, we looked at it and said, hey, this is something we should study and get an answer to it. And with that in mind, we went to Howard University and got $500. With that $500, we were able to go into the black community in the District of Columbia and have a survey and a grassroots meeting with them to ask and answer questions about why these data exist, why were African Americans so disproportionately afflicted with end-stage renal disease and yet so less likely to become donors. So with that in mind, we got 40 people. We identified, out of those 40, 2 people said yes, they would donate, and the rest of the 38 said no. But after the 2-hour sessions in which we had a donor and a recipient there to talk with them and educate them about this. At the end of the 2-hour sessions, all 40 signed donor cards. So this said to us that we had already in place something that we could use to change the mindsets of people relative to organ and tissue donation. And so with this in mind, we started the DC Organ Donor Program in the District of Columbia. And after 4 years, the number of African-American donors had doubled. The number of people who were signing donor cards had doubled. And during that period of time, the Dow Chemical Company had Agent Orange. This is long before you guys don't know much about Agent Orange. But Agent Orange was used in Vietnam, and the veterans came down with dramatic illnesses and cancers. And they needed a positive image maker. And so they heard our presentation. And so they donated a amount of money to go to a Golan Harris, which is a PR company that sent me across 25 cities in the United States, predominantly African-American cities, to increase organ and donation rates among the African-American population, a population that people said would not donate. And so with this in mind, with the increases in the Washington regional area, we did the same thing in the 25 sites and actually 5 historic black colleges. And as a consequence, we did another Gallup poll I think we started in 1986. And in 91, we did another Gallup poll, and it showed that the number of people who signed donor cards in the African-American population tripled. And the number of people who are now aware of the highly successful nature of transplantation tripled. Now, what we had identified in the DC group was that there were 5 reasons why African Americans were reluctant to become donors. The first was that African Americans were never educated or informed that African Americans need organs more than any other ethnic group. That was number 1. Number 2 was that African Americans had the belief that if I die and go to heaven, I need to take my organs with me because I'll need them in the new life. Also, the fear that if I don't take my eyes with me, I can't see my great-grandma in the hereafter. The fear that that it wasn't the right religious and proper thing to do, forgetting that it is in giving that you receive, it is in pardoning that you're pardoning, it is in dying you're born to eternal life. So when we shared this with the communities, this was the second obstacle. The third had to do with the fear that if I sign a donor card and I go to the hospital, they may want to take my organs before they worry about saving my life. So this was the third. The fourth had to do with the fact that the history of Tuskegee and other events that demonstrated that when you go to the hospital, they may want to use you as a guinea pig. And so that was the fourth obstacle. And then the fifth obstacle was racism, concern that if I give my organs, they're only going to go to white people. Now, this was funny because at Howard University, a predominantly black center, most of our organs were from whites, so that was kind of ridiculous. But sharing that information became important. So we did this across the 25 sites. As a consequence of the data that showed that this group that was unlikely to donate would donate, we then conceptualized MOTTEP, the National Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program, to do the same thing that we did in the African American population and all of the other ethnic groups. And we went to Congressman Stokes and Lewis Sullivan, who was the Secretary of Health during that time. And they then helped us to compete for a national grant, which over time between 1993 and 2010 contributed more than $16 million to get us to go into the community, to educate and empower the community So they'll become part of the solution to the problem. Now, the key that MOTTEP used in these efforts is not to go in and actually do anything other than to educate them as to what they are supposed to do, because they do all the work. One of the problems in the past has been with a lot of the grants that they go into the community, the people from the universities get all the money, and the community does all the work. In this effort, we go into the community, they get the funds, they do the work, and they also get the funding for community education and empowerment. They develop groups, social committees, financial committees, and other committees in the community to go into the community, educate and empower the rest of the community. So they will become part of the solution to the problem. And so this then is what we've done over the past 25 years in terms of educating and empowering the community to make a difference. And what we've identified is that this is a powerful way to get the community to change. And it's one of the most cost-effective ways of getting lifestyle changes. Get the community to do it. The community does it. We organize and allow them to be educated and empowered, and then they do the rest of it. And this has made a big difference in terms of getting the message across. One of the issues when I first started this effort, and remember one of the first groups I started with was in Detroit, was that they said that this method is never going to work. This is all about you, Clive Callender, and this is not going to work. Well, of course it does work, because it's not about me. It's about the community being educated and empowered to take a message that is very selfish and very important. And that is that this affects us, and we need to become part of the solution to the problem. Now, are there people who will not change their minds because of what I say? Yes. But more than 90% of the people that I've been able to talk to have changed their minds about organ and tissue donation because of the fact that we're talking about you and your sister, your brother, and when you and your sister and brother are involved, it's not just another person. Then it's me that becomes involved. And that's why it works, because it's one-to-one, face-to-face, and it's me understanding that I'm helping me. And so that self-centered issue that is present in all of us comes into play. And this is present in all communities. We took this message with our grant to 5 different ethnic groups, and the one group that we were not successful in was the Native American group. And I think as we look back at it, the reason was because we didn't have a good role model in the Native American group to make a difference. And of course, they have a complicated religious belief, which is not easy to overcome. But all other ethnic groups demonstrated that they would change their behavior and they would become receptive to it. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Clive, I was really shocked to see that 44% of black kidney donors will end up in kidney failure.
Not as shocked as I was.
Is there a way, I mean, if that holds up, should we not allow blacks to donate?
No, I think as I looked into it, I found the key factors that were evident were obesity, and as we know, obesity is becoming one of the commoner causes of end-stage renal disease. And the other issue that I found that people who had high GFRs. Normally, when we look for donors, I know being a donor doctor for many years and you working with it, you know that we looked at donors, but we only looked at them if they had low GFRs. We didn't appreciate the fact that if you have a high GFR, that may be very damaging to the kidney and result eventually in a lower GFR. So what I identified in looking at when we got the last grant that we had, was that there was a population who had high GFRs and who were overweight or obese. And in that population, You probably, if you're going to get that person done, you need a special consent. But unfortunately, I haven't really shared that information well. So that's something that's on me. I need to get that message out. But so I think there's a distinct population in the African American population that may. But that is frightening to say the least. And I don't know what else I can tell you because we haven't done enough research on it yet to find out if that is the reason why we have such an incredible disparity of data in terms of the African American donors. My position is that we just need to research and learn and find out which segment of the African American population should not be donors. Any other questions? Any disagreements with, you heard me talk about race as being something that should be changed in the science community. What do you think about that? Yes.
Not that I have a disagreement, but a question. You know, in the course of the lectures that we've had, the lecturers we've had this lecture, we've learned that in cancer treatment there are disparities, in trauma care there are disparities. We've learned about inherent biases that you might be unaware of. You know, we have lots of young doctors here, so how do we, as a young physician or as a young surgeon, move forward in our careers with the knowledge that that's where the reality is now, to be able to help change it?
That's a great question, and did all of you hear the question? Okay, how do we make a difference? And I think the difference is that in all levels of medical education, I think we have to all recognize that we all have biases, and we have to understand how to overcome those biases that we all have by treating everybody the same. I know it's a grandiose expectation that we need to have the White House and the Bureau, the Census and all that to also recognize that we're all one race. Now, of course, when the human genome identified that as an issue, most people accepted it cerebrally, but they didn't accept it otherwise. We wouldn't have all this issue about race. We'd be talking about different ethnicities. So one of the ways, I guess, is that we need to educate in medical school and in nursing school the fact that these biases are affecting our equitable administration of healthcare, and that to try to possibly overcome this by making sure that we're aware of these biases as we move on. I think that's one of the first steps, is recognition. And I think you stated it well, that all of the literature now is identifying that we all have these biases. There's so much data that shows that whether it's heart disease or trauma or cancer, that there are these disparities and the differences, but that we can help this by treating everybody the same and understanding that the social determinants of health may well be the number one problem that we need to overcome. And of course, that's a huge problem because poverty determines, or your social, let's put it this way, your social economic status determines where you live, the air you breathe, and almost everything else. And so whether there's pollutants in the air you breathe, whether pollutants in the water you drink, all those other things. And so I guess a compassionate taking care of everybody who we encounter is one of the best things that we can do. And if you have any other thoughts on it, and obviously you've thought about it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too that it's not just bias perhaps on the care of the practitioners, but there's some element of bias within the patients as well. And I think you mentioned some of those as being challenges, specifically with regards to this, which is perhaps the bias against healthcare providers or provide, so that there's biases on both sides.
As you bring it up, it's interesting. Harold Freeman won the Lasker Prize in 2000 because he addressed the application of social determinants of health and the patient navigator concept for cancer. And for the first 10 years, the cancer rates seem to decrease. But I think that whole concept of what you're talking about in terms of not only the bias on the part of the physicians, but the bias on the part of the patients, and whether it's whatever ethnic group they come from. And I think recognizing that this bias is reflective whether you come from an English-speaking group or a non-English-speaking group. And so I think your points are well taken that the patient has become part of the solution. And as we look, when most of us started practicing, the healthcare provider was the center or the focal point of the team. We now know and appreciate more than ever the patient is the focal point of the healthcare. And so the more we involve the patient in that, and the more we involve the community in that, the better off we are, and the sooner we're going to be able to get to the stage where we actually have equity. Because the conscious biases, as you say, and the unconscious biases make us what we are. Any other questions? If not, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, Juan.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
When you talk about these things, and I'm so naive, because,
Hey, how you doing? I'm good.
That was a fantastic lecture. I'm glad I was able to join.
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Working
And I'll tell you that
Yeah,
he
please
sent
give
your
him my
regards.
regards. Okay.
Working in Pittsburgh with Dr. Starzl, these things didn't exist. And so in my mind, I think, these aren't a problem anymore.
Right. Well, he helped me a lot in terms of getting that message out, because I remember when we first started working